Thank you, sir. Good to be with you. Thanks. Appreciate you. Thanks. Thank you. I don't know where. Thanks. Good to get to spend some time with you. I don't know where Mrs. Vanderplatz went, but I want to say thanks to all of Team Vanderplatz. There she is. Thanks to Family Leader, and thanks to all of you for having me. And thank you for letting me get out from backstage out here at a place where I have a little protective zone. I am a zealous Husker football fan. It's the second most important religion in my life. And there are a bunch of people back here who are vicious Hawkeye fans. They were talking more smack than is appropriate at a Family Leader conference. So I think we should do a lot about the 9th commandment, and we should be rebuking them in a carefrontation. But anyway, good to get some time together. I know that a lot of you, I stand between you and dinner. So I promise not to run long. There is a countdown clock, and I will stick to it. But you've heard from lots of great people today. Lots of them are my friends, and I hope it's been a wonderful conference. I've heard good things about it. I wish I'd been able to be here and agree and celebrate a lot of what they said. But since I don't know exactly what everybody covered, I want to make sure I don't recover any of the ground they covered. So let me give you some good news as your last part of the day. I'm not going to talk about politics at all. I want us to deliberate together a little bit on potentially an interpretive key to why our politics are so weird right now. Our politics are not at all healthy, and I think that some of why that is because we live in a time when normal community is in collapse. And I think it's helpful for us to have a shared sense of what our neighbors are experiencing and what we're experiencing that's way upstream from politics. Because I think one of the most fundamental things happening in our time and place is that politics is becoming more and more tribal, and it's filling more and more of people's mind share. Politics is rushing in to fill the vacuum of more normal tribes that should exist in our lives. Political tribes are pretty weird because none of us really believe, as much as we are sure that the other side is wrong in politics, and by the way, don't hear anything I'm saying as I get to the edge of why I'm not going to talk about politics. Don't hear me saying anything that sounds like the mushy middle. I'm the second or the third most conservative member of the U.S. Senate by voting record out of 100 people. So if we wanted to debate policy across the ideological spectrum, I'm all the way at the right end of that spectrum. And yet, besides just right to left, there's another more fundamental dimension we should be aware of, which is, do we really want political intensification to be crowding out all the rest of life? And I don't think healthy people do. I think a bunch of weirdos in Washington, D.C. do, but I don't think normal, healthy people in Des Moines and Ankeny, and I could go do my Iowa bingo card, but I won't, in the interest of time. We're over here partly because one of my kids has a triathlon tomorrow morning at Raccoon Park, so that's my favorite part of Greater Des Moines, a place that we hit 2 or 3 times a year. But I think normal people in Iowa and Nebraska and most places where people are raising their kids across the country know something is wrong when politics is rushing in to fill the void of the collapse of what I think of as normal tribes. We're meant to be tribal people. We're meant to be relational animals. We're meant to want to pull on oars with other people in common cause in the same direction. And the normal tribes, the tribes of family, of workplace, of neighborhood, of your church, of your local worshiping community, all of those tribes are in rapid atrophy. And because normal tribes are declining and we're meant to be tribal, a whole bunch of people are rushing in and saying, well, maybe I can find community in politics. I don't really believe in these people in Washington, D.C., that they could possibly do salvific work and bring us heaven, but maybe at least the enemy of my enemy can be my temporary friend and I can find community in politics. We should be aware of what's happening in our time as political loyalties and brands and tribes become more intense, and it's because of that stuff that's happening upstream. So I want to spend a couple of minutes trying to unpack what I think is happening in our time, and then get to what we as Christians in particular have to say to that moment that's a lot more important and a lot more interesting than anything we have to say in politics. But I believe in the stuff I have to say in politics. I just don't think it's my first order identity. My identity as a Christian and as a father and as a husband, frankly, even as a Nebraska football fan, but as a Christian and a husband and a member of my town, as a citizen of Fremont, Nebraska, and as an American, and as a conservative, all those things are far more important to me than political party. I care a lot about my political party. I care a lot about my political ideology, but I care about a bunch of things more than that, and I don't want to debate with my neighbor in a way that gets my loyalty so out of order, there's a word here somewhere. I don't want to debate about my identities in a way that makes people think I'm a Republican before I'm a Christian, or frankly, that I'm a football addict before I'm a dad. I've been lying about my age since I was 11 years old to get into Nebraska football games to vend in the stadium because we haven't had an unsold seat to a game since October 25th, 1962. And when I was a kid, we were poor and we didn't have tickets to the Husker games. And I wanted to go, so I fibbed about my age so I could work at the games. I care deeply about Nebraska football. And yet, if I care more about going to a Nebraska football game than what's going on in my kids' lives, there's something wrong with me. And I think a whole bunch of us and a lot of our neighbors are starting to act that way about politics, and it's a danger. There's an idolatry there that we need to be very cautious about if we're going to succeed in living a life of gratitude to return thanks to God by loving our neighbor. So here's what I think's happening in our time. We are living through a digital revolution, which is both really scary and really darn fascinating. I'm a historian by training. Most of my work history is as doing business strategy, and then I was a college president, but my actual training is I'm an academic historian, and historians' main job is to be boring at dinner parties. That's the main job of a historian. What we do is we track continuity and discontinuity over time, and usually there's a lot more continuity than discontinuity. Most stuff in life doesn't actually change that much, but humans, when we talk, and especially at dinner parties, we tend to use all these words like unique, one of a kind, unprecedented, extraordinary, as opposed to ordinary. And usually when people are doing that, the historian's ear perks up and you think, oh, I need to go find that person and tell them why they're wrong. Because usually there's a lot more continuity than discontinuity in almost everything that's happening in our lives. 10 and 20 years ago and 10 and 20 years from now, there's going to be a lot more that's common. Human nature isn't changing. There's a lot more that's the same 20 years ago and 50 years ago and will still be the same 20 years from now and 50 years from now. And yet when we talk, we tend to act like, you know, this is the inflection point in all of human history. It used to be from eternity past to 5,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 50 years ago, 5 years ago, everything was about the same. But right now, it's all changing, and it's really, really different. And a historian's job is usually to find that person by the punch bowl and say, you know, actually, most things are pretty flat, and the reason that you think this is the ultimate moment of inflection in human history is because you're a narcissist and you're here. And so really there's a lot more continuity than discontinuity. I want to say though, I'm going to go against type for a minute and say at the level of economics, we are living through one of the most interesting and one of the most disruptive moments in all of human history. There have only been 4 kinds of economics from the beginning of time at the macro level. Hunter-gatherers, agrarianism, manufacturing or the industrial age, and whatever the heck this thing is that we started entering 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Sociologists, they don't know what to call it. The mobile economy, the digital economy, the tech economy, the information economy. The sociologists have now just settled on calling it the post-industrial economy, which is another way of saying it's the after the last thing, but we don't even know what it is, right? So we had nomadism, hunter-gatherers. We had agrarianism, and I don't mean the agrarianism of Nebraska and Iowa farmers who actually feed the world. I mean, what we do today is high-tech digital super farming, but I mean farming from 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia until about 150 years ago in the rise of the Industrial Revolution, right? So the second stage of human history, agrarianism, well, when we went from hunter-gatherers to agrarians, we didn't have alphabets, so we don't have a whole lot of data about what that disruption looked like. So the only analog we have to our moment is when we went from settled farmers as 98% of the population to an industrial revolution where almost everybody left the farm. Most all people moved to cities across first world countries, and they were pushed from the farm because technology had substituted for labor and we'd become so efficient at what we'd done, and they were pulled to cities because these new factories were super productive and people specialized for the first time in economic history. right? Nomads and farmers, they didn't have job choice. They just did what grandma and grandpa and mom and dad and aunts and uncles had always done from the beginning of time. You went from 8 to 10 to 12 to 14. You didn't pick an economic specialty. Nobody asked an 8-year-old 5,000 years ago, what are you going to be when you grow up? You're just going to be better at doing what you do now because you're only 8. And when you're 12 and you're 16, you're going to have to do more of it. Job choice as a mass phenomenon is only about 150 years old, and it disrupted the whole world. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of cities and mass immigration and economic specialization and the rise of this mass phenomenon called adolescence, which wasn't just puberty, but this new thing where you don't just go from a kid's body to an adult body, but you actually come up with an economic specialty, it changed the whole world. What we're going through right now is like that on speed and going to happen many times inside every life. This has never happened before. There has never been a civilization of lifelong learners. There has never been a civilization where people thought, as a regular phenomenon, 35 and 40 and 45-year-olds are going to get disrupted, not just out of their job and their firm, but their entire industry and their skill set. And you at 45 or at 50 should expect, and especially our kids should expect, that they're going to have to find new jobs, new callings, new specialties, multiple times over the course of their life. This has never happened before, and it's both great and horrific at the same time. We're not very good at talking about things that are this disruptive and have some arrows that point up and some arrows that point down. We like everything to be Manichaean simple, good and evil in every development in our lives, but the digital revolution is both great and really scary at once. How? It's great this way. We are the richest people in all of human history by far. It is not even close. Middle-class Americans are, despite all the stuff the news will scream about every day and pretend that some tragic thing has just happened and somehow there's new poverty, and if AOC had the power and Washington could be in charge of everything, she could fix all the ills of capitalism. The reality is we are the richest people anytime and any place in all of human history. Nobody ever assumed median household income would be $60,000 a year per household that costs 320 million Americans. As recently as 150 to 200 years ago, most people lived in subsistence economies where 6 out of 7 people could die any given year if there was bad weather. We think biblically when you talk about having big storehouses. Think about Joseph off in Egypt and his brothers who've sold him into slavery, what they think during the famine. And as their father is dying, what's my brother going to do to me? But I need to go to him because he is the chief of staff. He's the prime minister to the Pharaoh. He's the super king of the region. And he has huge warehouses, and nobody has ever had huge warehouses. And we've got a famine, and Joseph has access to a barn. The richest people ever are us right now, where everybody you know has access to lots and lots and lots of insulation against a really bad harvest this fall. Richest people ever, and the digital revolution means we're going to create more economic value in the next 10 years than the world has ever known before. That's pretty great. That's a pretty interesting time to live. Here's the downside of it. We have never had identities that are as unsettled as what happens if 35 and 40 and 45-year-olds get disrupted out of work. Because one of the fundamental drivers of human identity, one of the ways God made us, He built into our soul, is a desire not just to think God's thoughts after Him, but to work. We're meant to work for 6 days and be productive. We don't work to earn our salvation. Sunday is a day that shows the picture of the fact that God does all the saving. But Monday through Saturday, I want to live a life of gratitude to God, and I'm meant to work. I'm meant to do stuff. I'm meant to be needed. I want to do things that benefit my neighbor and display gratitude to my Creator for what He's given me. And it turns out, if you're 35 and 40 and 45 and you get disrupted out of work and you don't know if anybody needs you anymore, that's a really, really scary place to be. And I'm not talking about an abstraction here. I'm talking about data. Do you know what happened last year? For the first time in recorded American history, we had the 3rd straight year of declining life expectancy in the US. We're the richest people on earth, and we're killing ourselves in a mass epidemic that we're not even talking about. We've had mortality data in the US since the 1930s. The last time we had a 2-year decline of life expectancy was in 1962-63, when there was a really bad flu bug that went from October of 62 through to March of 63. This one bad flu season drove down mortality levels in the US for 2 straight years. You know what's happening to us right now? In 2016, life expectancy went down in the US. In 2017, life expectancy went down in the US. And in 2018, for the first time in recorded American history, life expectancy went down in the US for the third straight year. How could that be? What's the equation that drives life expectancy? Well, 80-year-olds, our shared life expectancy in this room, none of us died by birth defects by age 1, our shared life expectancy in this room is 81 years old. My 8-year-old son is doing the triathlon, the Rip Roar Triathlon in Raccoon Park tomorrow morning. He was born in 2011 in Omaha, Nebraska. According to CDC tables, he has a 50-50 statistical chance of seeing age 100. 80-year-old longevity is up. 85-year-old longevity is up. Infant mortality is down. The two biggest drivers of death in the US, if you look at everybody who died statistically in 2018 in the US, a quarter died of heart disease and a quarter died of cancer. The third biggest death this year will either be COPD or stroke. They're competing to come in at third at 5.5% of the population. So statistically, we got a big long tail now. The two big drivers are cancer and heart disease, 25% each. Guess what? Both of them are going down. Cancer deaths are down, heart disease deaths are down. And yet life expectancy is headed in the wrong direction. Help me out with the math. How could this be? Do you know the answer? 25 to 45-year-olds are killing themselves in a mass epidemic right now. Liver disease, opioids, other forms of drug overdose, and suicide proper are all curves that look straight to the skies right now. What's happening? Why are 25 to 45-year-olds killing themselves? They're lonely. And they don't have a sense of calling. We live in a time when work is being disrupted really fast, and it's creating the horrors, not just the upsides, of rootlessness. It turns out economic necessity, which sounds bad, right? We all want to be freed from necessity. We want choice. We want to do what we want, what we need, not what we need to do, we think. But it turns out economic necessity is also kind of a blessing. Because it means that if somebody needs me, if I know what the work is that I need to do, it means that there's somebody who depends on me. It means that I matter in the world. And a whole bunch of people right now are having the gift/curse of rootlessness. There's this literature in sociology called the happiness literature. What makes people happy? Turns out, if you survey most Americans, they assume the equation about what makes you happy is like 100 variables long or 300 variables long. It turns out there are only 4 things that drive human happiness. It's a big, long, complicated equation with thousands of peer-reviewed studies, and there are about 4 things that drive human happiness. Do you have a family? When you go home tonight, is there anybody in your house that you're sharing a life with that loves you because you're in it together, because you're blood? Number 2, do you have any meaningful friendships? Not Facebook friends, not my good friend, the senator from the state of Vermont, whose face I'm about to tear off in a debate, not political friends, not the social casual way we use the word friend, but like Aristotelian friends. Is there anybody that you love so much that when they hurt, you don't choose it, you just do? And when they're happy and they feel joy, you feel joy, not because you chose it, but just because you share it with them. Think about the way you feel about your kids. I have teenage daughters. My girls are 15 and 17. If they hurt, I hurt. I don't get to make a choice to hurt or not. I just hurt because I love them. When my 8-year-old boy, when he's flying down the street on his bike and the sun is shining on his face and life is good, I don't choose to be happy. My shoulders just go back and my chest expands and my eyes well up because I love him, right? That's kind of how we think about friendship. Do you have a meaningful place of worship? Do you think you're needed at work? Let me tell you what's happening in America to all these basic indicators of human rootedness. Friendship is in statistical collapse. The average American has gone from 3.2 friends when I graduated high school in 1990 to 1.8 friends today. A halving of friendship in less than 30 years. 40% of Americans have 0 or 1 confidant. 40% of our adult neighbors have 0 or only 1 person they ever talk about anything meaningful with. When you survey 60-year-old men, 60% of them define their wife as their best friend. When you survey 60-year-old women, 29% of them define their husband as their best friend. Why? Because these men are so great at cherishing? No, they turn out to not have as many options. It turns out men tend to just atrophy relationships through the course of life after age 25. And one of the most basic drivers of whether men have friends is if they work next to the same guy for a long time. Well, guess what's happening right now? The average duration at a firm for a primary breadwinner in the 1970s when I was a kid was 26 years. The average duration at a firm right now is 4.2 years and getting shorter. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's hollowing out basic rootedness. What's happening to the family structure? 40% of American babies are now born out of wedlock. Again, I'm the second or third most conservative member of the Senate, but I sit in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's desk on the Senate floor because he was the first guy who shouted, hey, we got a big problem about the crisis of the black family in the mid-1960s. At that point, out of wedlock birth rate in America was 6%, and it hit 24% in the black community. And he said, America will collapse if the family breaks down. We have one subcategory of America that has an out of wedlock birth rate at 24%. And he said, we need to sound the alarm bells. Today, it's 40%. What's happening in America right now is an epidemic of rootlessness. We have lots and lots of people who feel homeless. Well, Christians, those of you who know your scriptures should be hearing in the back of your head, but wait a minute, guy. You're talking about this like economic revolution and technological change and sociology, like this is some new thing. I hope all the Christians in the room hear in the back of your head something like, wait a minute, isn't homelessness kind of a basic theological condition east of Eden? Yes and amen. Think about the scriptures if we had time to flee through them. When Abraham is called, he has to leave his father's home and go and search for the land of Canaan. As the Israelites are wandering in the desert, as there's a sojourn in Egypt, in Psalm 37, there's that great, but painful lament. As the Israelites say, and we sat down next to the waters in Babylon and we wept because we remembered Zion. They knew they were not yet in Zion. They knew they hadn't found the land flowing with milk and honey. They hadn't crossed over the Jordan. You accelerate all the way to the New Testament, and what do we find? We find the disciples constantly believing, rather than the already and the not yet that Jesus taught again and again and again. We find the disciples constantly believing the kingdom is almost there. On Palm Sunday, they want to act like it's a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus is going to be crucified. This is the King of creation, the Lord of all eternity, and he's riding a donkey into Jerusalem, and the disciples are saying ridiculous things like, so Jesus, when you get elected and you're inaugurating the new kingdom, I just want to make sure, I know I got a cabinet job, but could my brother also sit at your left hand at the head of state table? And Jesus says, the fox has a place to lay his head, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Again and again and again, it turns out we know from our texts that we have hope about a king who's going to establish a kingdom on his timeline. And we get live a life of gratitude where we can love our neighbor in this time and place, neither believing we're sufficient to bring about the kingdom, nor thinking that therefore we should despair and resign and have no hope about our obligations to love our neighbor. Anybody know Rosaria Butterfield's new book? The Gospel Comes with a House Key. If you don't know this book, I highly recommend it, both because it's wonderfully inspirational and because it just makes you so angry in ways that can only be a boomerang of self-conviction of sin. Rosaria Butterfield talks about how there's a woman who, as an adult convert to Christianity, ended up marrying a PCA pastor. But before that, she ran the LGBTQ movement at the university in upstate New York, where she was a faculty member for years. And she said, one thing I always find in the gay community, and this was before her conversion to Christianity, there's always unbelievable hospitality. You always know who the people are who will always invite you over for a meal. And she says, one of the things that's so weird about my new conversion to Christianity is we believe that on Sunday morning, we get to go to a table where the King of Heaven has a vine growing with branches that extend into this age, and I did nothing to set the table, and I get fed and consumed, and all I bring is the sin. All I bring is the sin, and God fills me up so that my cup can runneth over. Why wouldn't we then, every Sabbath brunch and Sunday evening, be inviting neighbors into our house? Because it turns out all around us, there are people who are despairing. There are people who are hopeless. There are people who are going through economic disruption. I was talking to a woman in Fremont, Nebraska, my hometown, early this morning, who works at Walmart at a store where they're trying out new robotics, and she's a I'm 47, she's not my age, but she's well beyond the, are you gonna go to higher ed or are you entering the workforce choice of the early 20s that most people make. And she finds that the robotics are displacing many of her hours. And at 40 hours a week, she could basically pay the bills. And at 30 to 32 hours a week, she can't really pay the bills. And she's despairing about the future. And that economic disruption in that one little instantiation of this one neighbor in my town is being played out all across America right now as the disruptions of the digital revolution, which are simultaneously going to create huge economic opportunity, but are going to create way more disruption to work than any people have ever really known before. It means we're going to have lots and lots and lots of neighbors who are crying out for genuine community, who are crying out for meaningful tribes, who are crying out to be invited to a table to feast alongside people who actually believe that the hope is coming and that I can't secure it. What an unbelievable opportunity to be the little children that Jesus calls to come to him, to say, how many of you who have 8-year-olds, kids or grandkids, believe that your 8-year-old can accomplish anything really big in the world as an 8-year-old? They can't accomplish any of this stuff. And yet we want them simultaneously to trust in us, to depend on us, and then to go overflow and live a life with all that exuberance of an 8-year-old that actually believes the future is secure. We believe that. Why wouldn't we then do politics different? Which is to say, hey, politics actually has a whole bunch of meaningful questions to address, but I don't think politics is the stuff of heaven on earth. I believe politics is about trying to not bankrupt our kids and have a cybersecurity strategy for an era where the Chinese are going to want to have a long-term tech race with the US and do a whole bunch of nefarious stuff in the South China Sea. I believe that we should be rethinking the supply side of higher education for all this workforce disruption that's going to disrupt a whole bunch of people's work. But I don't want to talk about politics like heaven is coming by politics, because it's not true. I want to talk about politics as a framework for ordered liberty, as freedom from a whole bunch of bad stuff, so that freedom to can be the stuff that actually happens in your congregations and your neighborhoods and your families. Because the center of the world is not Washington, D.C. The center of the world is wherever you're going to put your head on the pillow tonight. Not because it's a mansion that will last forever. Moth and rust will destroy your suburban or your rural or your downtown Iowa house. But you know what's sure? The Jesus that we serve has already gone to heaven, and he's preparing the mansion for us. Paul said, and if the tent that we dwell in should collapse, we have no fear, for we serve a Savior who's building a tent that's not made with human hands, for he will secure the kingdom for his glory, and we now have the chance to go out and love our neighbor in light of the fact that God will accomplish all that he will accomplish in his due time, and he's given us these years to live a life of gratitude, saying thank you, yes, and amen. Thanks for having me, family leader. Good to be with y'all.